On today's World Insight, Biden's first foray on the international arena will be a virtual G7 meeting. What is on the agenda of the U.S. and its closest partners? And we meet the new UN resident coordinator in China, Siddharth Chatterjee. As a two-decade veteran of the UN, what are his impressions of China?
China is a revelation. It is a revelation of what a country can achieve in such a short time.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei from Beijing. We begin today's program with this year's G7 virtual summit. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, this year's G7 chairman, hopes to convene the first in-person group summit in nearly 2 years in June. He's using the virtual talks to be held very soon to urge the development of new vaccines in 100 days. Fighting the pandemic, rebuilding the global economy, and coping with climate change are all high on the agenda. U.S. President Joe Biden also makes his first presidential debut on the world stage since he took office in January. On Thursday, U.S. officials said the Biden administration will pledge a $4 billion contribution to COVAX, a global initiative led by the World Health Organization to ensure equitable access to vaccines. However, the timetable is not clear. After Trump's America First policy, Biden has sought to reverse the situation, projecting a message of re-engagement with the world and with global institutions. But how hard will it be for Biden to rebuild ties with his G7 allies? And what does the G7 still offer to the world now? For more on the G7 and what can be achieved and what are still the question marks, we are joined in Chapel Hill in North Carolina, Klaus Laris, the Distinguished Professor of History, International Affairs from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In Tokyo, Tako Yashikatsu, Adjunct Associate Professor from the Asia Global Institute at Hong Kong University. In Washington, D.C., Peter Kuznick, a professor of history from American University. Last but not least, in Shanghai, we will be joined later by Shending Li, professor at the Institute of International Studies from Fudan University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let me start by asking the three gentlemen coming from originally Germany, Japan, and the United States. How high shall we have our hope for this year's virtual summit of the G7. Mr. Kuznick, would you like to begin briefly?
Sure, I'd be happy to begin.
Thank you, sir.
It depends on what the goal is going to be. Clearly, Biden wants to show that the United States is engaged with the world again, and he wants to show that the United States is going to lead the world again. The question is the rest of the world looking for or willing to accept American leadership? What the positive that could come out of this is a strong commitment to dealing with the pandemic in a global way that is much more fair and inclusive. As UN Secretary General Guterres has said, the current situation is absolutely untenable.
Okay.
Where should I continue?
Yes, maybe very briefly.
The G7 countries now have administered 75% of the doses worldwide. There are 130 countries that have administered no doses of the vaccine so far. So the first challenge to the G7 is to deal with the question of making this much more equitable globally. Then we've got other challenges as well.
Right. Let's start just by talking about the vaccines. Professor Laris, I know none of you is this epidemiologist, but rather we are focusing on the politics and also on the public policy of the vaccines. Professor Laris, 3 billion doses of vaccines have been acquired by Japan, Australia, the United States, the EU countries together with Canada. And yet, all they need to do, all the population of these countries, even having 2 doses per person, will still have 1.3 billion more left. Now, will the G7 virtual summit be able to contribute in real terms and in clear words, what time and what doses to whom those could be available? Professor Laris.
Perhaps to some extent, but this is a family meeting of the Western democracies. They know each other very well. It's President Biden's first foray into international policy at a big meeting. So there will be a lot of goodwill towards him. And I think everyone is aware of the problem regarding the vaccine distribution to the world outside the Western world. And they will go and strengthen the COVAX initiative, which is meant to provide vaccines to the developing world. Biden has also promised $4 billion of American money to put into that initiative, $2 billion almost immediately. Whether that will be enough, we will have to see. President Macron's suggestion to dedicate 5% of the Western world's vaccines to the developing world, to countries or continents like Africa, that has been rejected by Biden, I believe for largely domestic reasons, because many American people would not be impressed if the United States gave vaccines to outside America rather than vaccinating its own people first. And there's a severe problem with obtaining vaccines within the United States. Many states, many cities have problems getting the vaccine for Americans. So for domestic reason, I think Biden has decided to give money rather than promising to give actual vaccines.
Right.
But once Americans have been vaccinated by June, I think we will see probably something different here.
Well, there are several things I probably need to clarify here. COVAX is not necessarily just a platform that will provide vaccines to developing countries. In fact, developed countries, after joining COVAX, could also purchase and have access to vaccines through COVAX. So that's one thing to clarify. Another thing to clarify, COVAX, despite of operating in full capacity, by the end of the years that it has claimed, only 20% of the world's population could be vaccinated. That's so far away from any herd immunity that needs to be achieved in any country. So we need to clarify this just to say COVAX is not a magic. And meanwhile, it's not just developing countries that are getting vaccines from the COVAX, but also developed economies as well. This is very clear. Thirdly, it's not about the cash, because the vaccines are in short supply compared to the cash that could be offered in the world. It's the vaccine that really counts. Having said that, though, let me go to you, Mr. Yoshikatsu. My same question. Will the G7 countries be able to say clearly this time how much can they contribute in terms of vaccine to the rest of the world, which they have been hoarding over the year?
I think now the President Biden is coming up with, and now for G7, I think the most important thing is show our leadership, G7's leadership and unity. And because now, maybe over the last couple of years, G7's credibility or accountability are, very much doubted. And in this sense, at this moment, and Boris Johnson is going to host the real G7 conference in June. So before that, I think now we can meet up and we can show our leadership and unity and show our agenda. We need to aggressively respond to COVID-19 and vaccine in terms of vaccine distribution and how to coexist the tackle to COVID-19 and the economic recovery. And in this agenda, the G7 as liberal democracies, we can demonstrate our leadership and unity to be responsible for this very important time. So this is the first agenda. And then what's going on? Let's see. And I do not think it's going to be very easy to provide the vaccine distribution or allocating the real resources to respond to the pandemic. So let's see what's going on.
Professor Shen, on the other hand, I do want you to join in as well. China, of course, is not part of the G7, but the world is watching the G7 very closely right now because it's the first time after U.S. President Biden comes into the White House. How much will G7 still relevant to the world. What do you think will be some of the barometers, the other parts of the world are looking at right now?
Well, G7 is not irrelevant at this time yet. But increasingly, the other international platforms like G20, United Nations, WHO, and APEC, etc., they would play their respective role. So it's important for G7 to partner with other countries and other regional and global platforms to work together, contributing the battering of the COVID-19 together. Not just G7 or China would give some 37 countries. We should shake hands and work together. G7 should welcome China, and China should also welcome G7 and individual members of G7, especially the US, to pay a good contribution. I have heard that France is willing to give 5% of what it is going to use. That 5% is measured by millions. But the entire developing country, in terms of the population, is measured by billions. Therefore, France's commitment, in my view, is far short of what the US will do and what the rest of the world would expect of France.
We earlier have already looking at some of the footages coming in. The G7 virtual summit has already begun as we go on with our discussion. So we have something going on here, gentlemen, that's very interesting, is whether the G7 nations and parties have been able to clarify what they really want to do individually. And at this critical time, at a time when probably they have to choose A or B or one or two, would they be able to come to consensus about the choices? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Mr. Yoshikatsu, your thoughts about that. Will G7 be able to choose together, come to consensus? After all, they've been apart for at least 4 years, if not more.
Yes, Tianwei, you just mentioned the U.S. re-engagement to multilateralism or global institution. And actually, this is a very important thing for G7 leaders at this moment, because over the last 4 years, actually, the G7 was quite, divided. So we couldn't have shared basic vision. So, for example, what is democracy? What is multilateralism? What is human rights? Actually, even among 7 countries, we couldn't have shared very well. So now, I think the most important thing is let's make sure what is the world, what we want to embrace, right? Multilateralism is very important, and regional integration is very important. Respect on United Nations or World Health Organization is quite important. So now, at this critical moment, the most important thing for us is make sure what is the most important thing. As a developed economy, we need to be responsible for the world peace and human beings, right? So this is the top priority at the moment, and now this is just the beginning.
But it's very interesting to talk about the principles, because the principles one would assume should have long been shared. If the principles are not even being shared, that would be very interesting, whether G7 still exists at all as an entity. Having said that, though, it is about how the principles will be translated into realities, isn't it? Professor Pusnik, we've seen the U.S. withdraw from WHO, WTO, and of course the climate agreement. But now, with the Biden administration coming into power, it's coming back. But nobody knows what's going to happen in 4 years, probably even 2 years during the midterm election. So, how do you see the U.S. will be able to testify to the allies that it will be back and will always be back? I think that's one interesting question.
We don't really know what's going to happen in 2 years or 4 years in the United States. The situation here is quite volatile right now. We just saw an insurrection a month ago at the Capitol. It was an attempted fascist coup in the United States. So things are very, very uncertain. But Biden at least is starting off in the right direction. I mean, today, the United States officially re-enters the Paris Climate Accords, which Biden announced his first day. He's rejoined the WHO. He renewed the New START treaty with Russia, very, very important. The reality is that the world confronts 2 or 3 existential crises right now that we've got to deal with as a global community because it affects everybody. We've got the climate change, which is a serious threat. We've got the nuclear arms race. All 9 nuclear powers are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, making them more efficient and more deadly. We've got the pandemic that we've got to deal with. So there's so much reason why we've got to work together right now. And even if it is a competition, China and Russia have been taking the lead in providing the vaccine for other countries around the world. In Africa and other places, the West is trying to catch up, and that's a good thing. I mean, there could be positive competition. Which country can show that it's best suited to serve the world's interest in a positive way? And that's the kind of competition I would like to see, because we have different systems with different assumptions and philosophies behind them. And we can see which can work most efficiently to help the world rather than to divide the world the way Trump has tried to do for the past 4 years.
Okay. During the G7 virtual summit, it seems that Professor Shen, China will also be one of those topics, at least according to some media reports. Now, I'm not sure because the meeting has just begun. So, Professor Shen, from China's perspective, how are you looking at the meeting? And also, is China seeing an opportunity to develop sound relationship with the members of the G7? On what terms? Professor Shen.
I think President Biden has mentioned that he would. I think President Biden has mentioned that in his speech to be delivered at the G7, he would raise 3 issues: pandemic, economy, and the challenge of China. So, for your question, the challenge of China is China has cleared its house very well. So U.S. need to do a good job to compete with China. And second, why China is providing vaccine to its own people, China is also offering international public goods. China has a plan to give this vaccine to 37 countries in the first batch, and China probably would give this to more countries. And then U.S. need to compete with China. And China is shaping international order which makes China to be looked as more competent. And the U.S. want to lead, U.S. wants to make itself to be viewed as more competent, to have the capacity to lead. So U.S. has changed the term from Trump's time, China and Russia as a rival, to China is a challenger. U.S. has downplayed the so-called threat that China has presented. But China is threatening the U.S. in cleaning its house, in providing public goods. So welcome the U.S. to compete with China in this area, but we need to have a healthy competition, not to blend each other in a negative sense. U.S. can get some lesson how China defeated the pandemic. China can share its experience. And also, we can give money to WHO, U.S. give $4 billion, and putting all this money together, and more countries would give donation, including those from Japan. And we should assure those underdeveloped countries would have fair amount of weapon to handle a pandemic. If G7 would conclude, let's work with China in a healthy competition and compete wherever there is necessity, but in a positive tone, not to exclude China, to make a clique of exclusion, then I think G7 can be a good existence for China to be compared and to compete with.
All right. Now we have 1 minute left also for Professor Laris. Please share with us the view about G7 China.
Yeah, I mean, the G7 is a traditional meeting. China is included in the G20 meeting as it should, but I think it should be perfectly okay if 7 nations want to get together to discuss things without China, without India, without Saudi Arabia. Why not? There's nothing wrong with that. And the G7 is divided among itself. They cooperate in some instances on climate change, on the COVAX initiative, and by the way, the more cash you have for COVAX and for the vaccines, the better you can produce more vaccines, of course. And they are divided in other things. You know, for example, the EU investment treaty with China, which was concluded in December last year, was not all that much applauded by the United States. So they get together and discuss things, and whether they get their act together and are united in all respects, that needs to be seen. But it's not a bad idea to just have a club of nations to talk about things. But I would like to say what is perfectly right is that the United States and China should engage with each other directly. That would be the best way forward. If the two superpowers of the world engage with each other, okay.
Yeah. But I heard your voice and also your ideas. Thank you so much for your contribution. Time is limited for a very comprehensive discussion. Klaus Laris, Kato Yoshikatsu, Peter Kuznick, and Shending Li, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Hope we can continue our conversation in the near future. Really appreciate it. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come in the program, we meet the new UN resident coordinator in China. As 2 decades veteran of the United Nations, what are his important tasks this time in working with the Chinese government? Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The United Nations has selected the new resident coordinator in China. This Indian humanitarian professional has served in some of the most fragile countries in the world, and he's passionate about making differences through partnerships and public policies in China. He took the rounds, as we took around in his office, he surprised us with his special yoga talent.
So they say that's it. Hello, colleagues. How's everybody today? All well? Yeah. Yeah? All under control? Great, great. Have a good one.
So, first time ever. I've never had this.
This is the inauguration of my mat today. I do this twice a day because it allows me to have mind and body balance. And this is known as the queen of all yoga exercises. It's called the Shirsasana.
Yes.
And I can demonstrate it to you.
Oh my God.
So this is how we go.
All right.
And I kneel down here slightly, put my hands forward, and from here I go up.
Holy cow, wow. Oh my God, Sid, I'm really impressed. You are terrific. First ever UN resident coordinator. Hands up. How long do you?
I do it for 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Oh my God. So this is a guy who make a lot of things happen.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Thank you.
I need to learn from you.
Yeah, and you know.
I might visit your office often just to have some instructions.
And
What's
breathing.
next?
And breathing. But it's in Chinese philosophy too. Tai Chi is all about breathing and the motion of body. There's no difference between India's yoga and traditional Chinese martial arts.
Yes, and also to have a good relationship with the nature, with our environment.
Absolutely, and with the mind and body. You know, that equilibrium often gets out of sync, and that's why we tend to fall sick. So I exercise a lot, and I do my yoga, I do my running. I just ran in the Olympic Park. I did 10.5 kilometers, and I was ready to go for the next 10.5 kilometers.
I'm looking forward to many talks that we could have. You're fun, Sid. Well, a yoga master, a good storyteller. Sid is always passionate about telling Chinese stories and experiences to his UN colleagues. As we sat down for an exclusive interview, he said the world today needs to regain momentum in achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG, and China's path of poverty eradication offers insight for the world to follow. Let's listen in. Sid, what a pleasure to see you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Happy Lunar New Year to you.
Happy Lunar New Year. It's an honor. It's my first Lunar New Year ever in China. It's my first time in China, and what a celebration it has been.
I know you were celebrating, but I know you were also quite busy meeting with people, as many as possible. Yes. You were just out of the quarantine, but already, having a lot of great meetings. Yes. Tell me more about them. Are they successful?
First of all, I think for me, China is a revelation. It is a revelation of what a country can achieve in such a short time when there is a strong political determination to make it happen. So when you read about a country that has lifted 890 million people out of poverty in just a matter from 1980 to now, one has to understand the size and scope and witness it to understand what it really means. And I feel what China has achieved in the multifaceted way, its influence in the multilateral space. The environment of Beijing, I went for a run here, and it feels like as if I'm running in a clean air environment. I look at my phone and I see the temperature, and if it's -3 and the AQI levels are at about 20%, I said I'm good to go. I went for my run over here. So it's just fascinating. But I arrived here on the 6th of February of 2021 after my quarantine. And each day has been quite spectacular. First of all, meeting with my own team, getting to know my colleagues within the UN family, meeting with, and I was honored that the government of China gave me my credentials quite quickly so I could get to work. So I've been meeting some of the ambassadors, and I've just now come back after meeting with the president of the Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank, President Jen. And it was amazing to see the scope of multilateralism that I'm seeing within the institutions inside Beijing.
It's amazing, isn't it? A lot of things are happening and changing as we speak. Yes. What do you think will be your role here? Your role, first of all, is relatively new. Only your predecessor began to have the title of the so-called resident coordinator, but that's the new role that the UN has designed for anyone that's responsible for coordinating a country's operation of the UN. So tell me about your role, particularly at this critical time and uncertain time and unpredictable time.
So, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, when he came in as the Secretary General in 2017, he came in with a very clear determination and purpose. He wanted 3 things to happen. Number 1, a reformed UN. Number 2, a UN which is fit for purpose. Number 3, a UN that delivers as one. So in 2019, for example, in Kenya, I was the UNDP resident representative and the UN resident coordinator. He says, no, it's not going to work effectively. You need to have a resident coordinator who's de-linked from the entire UN system and basically has a coordination and an oversight role. And therefore, there is what you would term as mutual accountability that I have with every head of agency, fund and program. The vision of the Secretary General is a UN that is able to deliver in lockstep with the priorities of the government. That is what the UN is meant to be. It's a member states organization. So this Friday, as a matter of fact, it's good that you're asking me this question. I have a 3,500 word essay which will be published. And that 3,500 word essay will be both in English and in Chinese. And it's essentially laying out my vision.
So what is your vision?
The vision is, how does the UN deliver as one in terms of the priorities that the country has? There are areas that we could work on together, achieving universal health coverage, on the environment, on, let's say, access to fresh water. And the gaps where the government feels, okay, here are the gaps in the country in terms of our development trajectory as we are marching towards Agenda 2030 or the Sustainable Development Goals. The President of China, President Xi Jinping, is very clear. He wants China to be a model of the SDGs. I hope you heard his speech in Davos. It was spectacular. In fact, it was poetry and philosophy with profound statements that came out. He talked about the COVID. He said, it's just like after a winter comes a spring and out of darkness comes a morning. This will also pass, but what it should leave behind is resilience. We need a global, robust health system. Any country which is lagging behind in its health system makes the whole world vulnerable. And I think here is an opportunity that I hope to work the entire UN family with the government of China to improve SDG 3. SDG 3, or universal health coverage, where is going to be the anchor to the success of all the remaining goals. It is clear.
It's very interesting you talk about healthcare and health, because the top priority now is the pandemic. At the just concluded conference, including the involvement of the UN Secretary General about the vaccines, we have seen more than 100 countries in the world have never received even one dose of vaccines, yet the richest top 10 countries in the world are having most of the vaccines. Now, when you talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, that is grand. But when it comes to life, it is very specific. So, Sid, I really have to be frank here. How is the UN going to testify in front of the world that it still serves its purpose, which is bring equal access to as many people as possible? I know you're in China, but your role is also about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, this is why you need political will. This is why the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, this is why the head of WHO, Dr. Tedros, this is why President Xi Jinping have been outspoken about the global common on immunization. I think when your president said that vaccines are a global public goal, it was a profound statement. It was a message throughout the world. And I think we all need to converge on health. This is where the new multilateralism is going to be, of ensuring that we make everybody health. Anybody left behind makes the world vulnerable. So I feel that the role of the UN has actually become strengthened. That China is actually helping to strengthen that role. After all, we are a committee of nations. We are represented by member states, and it's up to member states on where it wants to see the UN. I think the timing of my arrival here, the issues that are emerging in the world, the fact that we only have 9 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, this is the time where our Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed says, you have to flip the orthodoxy. You can't do business as usual. I feel with the Chinese government, with the UN country team, with the member states, we could actually be advancing the health, the agriculture, the education, the water, the climate, all these agendas simultaneously, because the whole world is interdependent. There is no decoupling. Economics cannot be decoupled. People cannot be decoupled. They will continue to travel and interface with each other. The opportunity that China is showing to the rest of the world as a country which has come from scratch. I mean, look, in the 1960s, let's look at the per capita GDP. The US's per capita GDP was at about 26.7%. China's per capita GDP was at about 2.3 or 3%. Today, look at where China is standing as a global economic giant. But what China has shown, that it's possible. And I see there are 3 P's that are important. Number 1 is political will. Without political will at a nation-state level, at the leadership level of the UN, at any level, it's not going to happen. Now we are already seeing multiple layers of political will, whether it's the European Union, President Biden has been very clear about the climate, the Secretary General is repeating and bringing global leaders together. We've heard your president in Davos, which I thought was a spectacular and quite a moving speech for many of us who watched it end to end. The second is public policy, the second P. Now, public policy shapes what governments can do, and this is again a place where the UN has an important role, regardless of which country it is in, to work with governments to shape the public policy that impacts the furthest behind.
But, you know, people here, the government very committed. Also, I think a lot of Chinese you have met over the past week or so, they must be telling you that they want to contribute to the world, and they are. If you look at the vaccine, I'm just using that example, Sid. China has been donating 10 million doses of vaccines to COVAX, has been helping provide vaccine aids to 53 developing countries as they were asking for help, and has been exporting right now to 22 countries around the world. But people here might also want to know, what are the other countries doing? What are the developed countries doing? I mean, you as the representative of the United Nations here in China, people might just approach you from the street and say, So what about the other members of the UN? Are they also trying to do what we believe is correct, what the UN believes is correct, Sid?
So, Wei, on this, the Secretary General, Dr. Tedros, have been outspoken. This is a human rights issue. It is about making sure that nobody is left behind. It is like, we are talking about, the reality is we are all in this together and we will come out of this together. There is no one, if you leave one country, one community, one village behind who has not been immunized or not vaccinated, the potential of that vaccine coming and hitting back again, as we are already seeing, the variants that are coming out from certain parts of the world. Yeah. And this is where the unison is. But there is a third P to this, and that's the partnerships. And this calls for a new type of partnership. It is about the UN, the private sector, governments all coming together. I'm actually looking at COVID as becoming the renaissance of multilateralism.
I like that analogy. I hope you're right.
It is the renaissance of multilateralism. I mean, I feel that today where we are, the fact that, look at the speed with which a vaccine has come out. Who could have thought about it? I mean, technical wisdom. I had polio as a child. And the fact is, I missed a vaccine and the vaccines were still evolving that time. But I was lucky that it was caught at the right time. But today, the same vaccine has eradicated polio in China, in India, in most of the world. But those vaccines are not automatic. They take years to build. The fact that, look at what science has done. China, Russia, US, UK, their scientists having come together, developed vaccines which is inconceivable. But look at the advances mankind has made in science, in technology, in innovation. However, having said that, we find out now that actually influenza rates across the world has dropped. Do you know why? What COVID has taught us is that we need to wash our hands, we need to wear a mask, we need to maintain some space. It has led to a reduction of influenza. I was in Kenya, and I want your audience to know this. In the early part of March, we realized that COVID will come to us in Kenya. And we started to work with the government. So the government instituted very robust policies in place of isolation, of quarantine, of travelers coming in, etc. Huge amount of social media messaging. I put about 150 UN staff from agencies, funds and programs to support the government of Kenya. We redeployed about $45 million US from our existing UN Development Assistance Framework to respond to the public health crisis. You know what happened? We suddenly found that we could not get gloves, PPEs, masks. It was unavailable. End of March, a plane arrives. An Ethiopian Airways plane arrives. And China sends through, for countries in Africa, a huge supplies of PPEs and all that, and that proved to be the determining factor of how many African states responded. Today, Kenya is actually shown as a poster child of success in terms of managing the COVID outbreak. It was recently featured in the Independent. So I want to take this opportunity to also thank the Chinese government for that early response, without which we probably would have had a different report card. So it is showing that when nation states can come together and look at health, the environment, as a common existentialist crisis, can then the UN be better at its work? Will member states have improved outcomes? But ultimately, it is about the prosperity of all and leaving no one behind. And this is how we will prosper.
I know you are a very optimistic person. You're also having a great can-do spirit. I know, Sid, because I've been hearing a lot of stories before I talk to you. But you're also facing another challenge, because you're the guy, between the United Nations and China. Rather, also between the United Nations members of the UN and China. So now there seems to be an interesting period of development in the world politics about China, about China's relations with the rest of the world. How would you be able to keep that balance well, particularly within a UN bureaucracy, particularly when you are communicating with other of your colleagues from different organizations of the UN and the member countries?
So, first of all, I have to say that for me, it's a singular honor that the Secretary General chose me to come to China. It's a singular honor that the Chinese government accepted my candidature. So that is the starting point. I've spent over 24 years in the UN system. I've worked in war-torn countries like Somalia and Iraq and South Sudan and, you know, many of these places. When I come to China, I'm inspired. The day I landed here, the day I landed in Guangzhou, because I read about Guangzhou's history, it used to be a very poor place, you know.
So you are doing your quarantine in Guangzhou.
So, you know, I come to Guangzhou and I'm thinking I'm actually coming to some remote part of China, and then suddenly I realize that I've actually walked into a place which is economically buoyant with the infrastructure and bustling. But how within 1 or 2 generations, life has changed. And this is precisely the kind of change we need to demonstrate to the rest of the world. You know, that you could actually be a part of the third world and progress out of that. Many countries, I was honored to serve in Kenya. And I've seen how Kenya has pulled people out of poverty, has advanced as a nation state. But today, more than ever, the world needs to come together to fight common threats, pandemics, environment, all the other crises. The issue is, today it's the survival and the thrival and the prosperity of humanity. It is not about individual nation states, but people need to be inspired. I, as the resident coordinator, intend to tell the China story to everybody in the world.
The new UN resident coordinator in China. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching and bye for now.